AnnAlia Young is a skilled professional with almost 2 decades of community leadership experience and a decade of work experience in marketing and program development. She has extensive experience and expertise leading and managing groups, writing and editing marketing plans, newsletters, technical documents, creating and evaluating marketing surveys, communicating with the government, media, and the public, and program project planning. She's one of those people who's direct yet very easygoing. That's her own description of herself. I back that one up. Able to establish mutually productive relationships with colleagues and clients at every level. She studied child development and family relations at the University of Idaho and currently works at Dominican Sisters of Mission San Jose. She's also served actively and continues to serve actively in various ministry and leadership roles in her church, has done so for more than 20 years. A native of Lewiston, Idaho, AnnAlia currently resides in Dublin, California, not Dublin, Ireland, Dublin, California. She's married and the mother of 2 children. Her interest in manners and etiquette stemmed from 4 years of training during her high school years, which she has continued to utilize in adult life. And if I got anything wrong or inaccurate there, I'm going to give AnnAlia the opportunity to correct or update that. But please welcome to Coffee Breaks with Steve, AnnAlia Young. AnnAlia, good morning to you.
Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be here. Thank you for having me, Steve.
Absolutely. It's looking forward to this one for a long time. And I do have to give credit where credit is due, because Shalane, my daughter Shalane, who is also a dear friend of yours, AnnAlia, was the one who recommended to me, told me about your background and being a student of manners and etiquette, and said she would be great to have on the show. And so we've talked about this and been working toward this for a few months now. So I'm glad we're finally able to do this. And using my own manners, just want to say thank you. But AnnAlia, we talk about the fact that you don't consider yourself an expert in this field, and yet it's something that has been a very active part of your life and your studies. And I just thought maybe a good place to start is just to ask you, what do you know about some of the history of social practices and the things that we consider to be sort of polite behavior?
Yeah. Well, I'll start by giving a little bit more background about my foray into etiquette and why it means so much to me to this day. So, interestingly enough, I went to a small Christian school that didn't believe in dancing. So we never had a prom or a ball or anything like that. But what we did do is have what was called protocol dinners. And so we would get to wear all the fancy dresses, and the boys would wear tuxedos. And we had 2 weeks of etiquette and social events training prior to each of these events. And so we would learn how a table was set and which fork to use and which glass to use and on which side of the plate it should be placed. And we learned how to cut our food and, hold it with your fork. You could do European style or American style and cut it. And so eat it very carefully so you didn't make a fool of yourself and make a big mess and all of these kinds of things. But 4 years of that it was just such a wonderful experience. It sort of instilled in me not necessarily a love for all the rules around etiquette, because I believe that etiquette is there's etiquette and then there's good manners. And I would say that etiquette is sort of the formal rules about how you do things, but good manners is how you treat people and how you relate to them and how you show respect by everything that you do. And so given that, I sort of fell in love with the fancy and the cordial atmosphere around a beautiful table when I was in college. And I lived in a Christian boarding house that was 3 stories high. It was Bavarian style, and it had stained glass windows in the dining room. And it was a family of 6, 4 children, 2 parents, 4 children, and they had 12 boarders, co-ed. And we would sit in this dining room and we would have they didn't actually serve a fancy table, but they set the table. And we would have conversations that were so rich about philosophy, about life, about politics, about love, all of these things that really instilled a love for the beauty of a good conversation in a beautiful setting.
Mm.
So with that, now remind me of your question, Steve. I do tend
Oh,
to.
just yeah, no, I just think, and I think that was a great place to start because it did give that personal perspective, AnnAlia. But I'm just curious about. I know that you have looked into and done some research on
Yeah,
where some of the
history.
traditions and things that we recognize as etiquette and good manners and politeness have historical
Yes,
perspectives, and I was just
that's
curious
true.
about some of those.
And interestingly enough, it started with the Egyptians. Believe it or not, 3,000 years before Christ. The Egyptians sort of wanted to have civil attitude towards one another. And so they started developing some ways of being together. And that's where etiquette really started. And then, oddly enough, Confucius really believed that there should be morality in everything that someone does. So they started building a framework around making sure that people behaved properly with a certain amount of courtesy and respect. But
Mm.
what we know as etiquette today really came in the 17th century with King Louis the 14th.
Okay.
He is the one, the word etiquette actually means placard. And so he used to put signs with the rules of how to behave on them, like keep off the grass was probably the first etiquette. The first
And that
etiquette.
one came out of Louis and the French. Keep off the grass.
Yes. But
I love it.
they also had rules about how people behave. But this is where the snob factor sort of came in to etiquette. They wanted to differentiate themselves from the masses. And so they would develop really refined ways of eating that were, very extensively, a specific tool for almost every type of food. And I actually have some examples, Steve, if you're ready for me to show you some of these
We can absolutely do that.
sort of beyond just Louis the 14th, but into Victorian times, which was also known for its highfalutin etiquette rules, where they had a lot of servants that helped them make this happen. So here is this. This is a fork. Yes, it has tines, but this fork is for snails. You only use this
Ah,
fork when you eat snails. Now, I don't know how often you serve snails at your house, but I have to say I've never done it. So
hey, I have actually eaten escargot in Paris, France, and I recall having tines very, very similar to this to use with that particular appetizer.
well, there it carries on. It carries
Okay.
on. So, and then here, this is in Victorian homes were very large and very cold. And so they had spoon warmers. So they would have spoon warmers at the table. So you would put your spoon in here, keep it warm. That way the food would stay warm from your plate to your mouth. So a very specific use
Okay.
tool. And these are not jacks. Okay. This is
Okay.
not a children's game, right? So
Right.
these are actually knife rests, so that when you had your 14-course meal, you could place your knife on this rest and it would keep your tablecloth clean. So I actually think these have use today. I sort of want to buy some of these. But
I would too, because it drives me nuts to have to sometimes set the knife, along the edge of the plate, and then you're concerned that it's either sliding into your food or falling off the edge, and to
exactly.
have something like this that, yeah, I'd invest in that.
Yeah. So I think you can get them on Amazon, but I haven't found a set that
Oh,
I thought would be suitable. And
interesting.
this is a these are grape scissors. So they come in a special case, and you had to snip your grapes before you could actually touch them with your hands.
So you would snip the little stem at the top of the grape and then hold
Yes,
it by the stem and rather than pulling the grape off.
that's right. You would snip
Oh,
them.
lovely.
Yeah, yeah. So
Oh,
uh,
great.
I think that's all of them for now. I'll go back
Okay.
to We
Go ahead
can
and
get it.
move this off the screen for the Mo.
Yes, yes, please move that off the screen. There, we're back.
I love the fact that, that first of all, you think about some of the things that we even use today. We're talking about the snail forks or things like being concerned about where we place the knife. And it is interesting to recognize that some of the stuff we just take for granted. And
Mm,
yet there are such wonderful historic backgrounds for these. I'm also curious because there are things that were developed centuries ago, but there's also a part of me that goes, I was raised with certain norms in
mhm.
terms of both the etiquette, the proper way to do things, but also just the treatment of other people. Now, growing up, I grew up primarily in the 60s and the 70s, but I'm just curious. I mean, that we know that certain things have changed. And I did want to share one personal story. I've shared this before, and my sister Kathy is on here. We've talked about this, and she doesn't even specifically recall this. I do. It has stuck with me. Kathy is a couple of years older than I am. And so when I started high school, I was a freshman, she was a junior, and we walked to school. And right from the outset, and she never did this with any sense of patronizing, it was done, she did it very deliberately, and yet herself expressing a sense of manners in doing it. But she kind of got me used to the idea and kind of steered me toward the idea that I should walk on the outside of the sidewalk, the street side of the
Mm,
sidewalk. We were walking to school.
mhm.
We'd get to the school and she kind of encouraged me and taught me to open the door for her. And again, she never did it like, all right, little brother, you have to do this stuff. There was a teaching and mentoring process to it. And finally, after several days of this type of thing going on, I said, why are we doing this? She said, you're in high school now. And it's not going to be that much longer before you're going to start to go out on dates.
Oh,
And I want to make sure you understand how a gentleman behaves toward a lady.
right, right.
It stuck with me, not like, again, in no way was it a talking down or a patronizing. It was like, I appreciated it then, and that has stuck with me to this day. And Kathy, in talking about, she says, "Yeah, I don't even remember doing that." Well, probably because it was such a natural part of her behavior
Mhm,
toward me as
mhm,
her
mhm,
younger brother, who she never. I mean, that was another part of her behavior toward me. She never excluded me from interacting with her friends, which would have been natural, not only because I was the kid brother, but I really was weird and nerdy and geeky, and she would have had every reason to do so. But she helped prepare me, as did growing up in a house with sisters and with a mom who helped raise
mhm,
me with
mhm.
those certain things. Please, thank you. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. I mean, we didn't always say yes, sir, and yes, ma'am, but we treated adults with cordiality and respect. And was raised to act like a gentleman. We didn't put our elbows on the table. We didn't chew with our mouth open and different things. And I'm just curious about some of the things that you're aware of, old ways of doing things that have changed in more modern times.
Yeah, I think that you're talking you're touching on sort of men and women's roles.
Mhm.
And as we
To some
know,
degree. Yeah.
there's been a revolution uh,
Yeah.
in terms of what is considered respect and what is considered patronizing.
Mhm.
But I think some of those rules still exist as kindness, but who actually does those rules is a little bit. I think like the opening doors situation.
Yeah.
I think that I think you're just I think the general rule is you're just kind to whoever's behind you and you open the door
Exactly.
regardless of their gender. But I
Exactly.
think I think the rule of opening the door for elderly people is still there because they
Mhm.
need help. And I think that is definitely still there. In terms of walking on the outside on the sidewalk, that is not a rule that I ever grew up with. So I didn't know about that until
And that
recently,
one
but I
came historically as well. Just to mention this, that I think the history of that what came from days when there were dirt roads and water could splash up, and the
yes.
gentleman would walk on the outside to protect the lady from whatever road debris or water might splash up from the road. Now, when I'm
Yeah.
walking with Carol, for instance, down a sidewalk, this I will still automatically kind of vary toward the outside, unless I'm seeing that there are, for instance, in certain neighborhoods, maybe it doesn't appear as safe depending on who you see sitting along a building on the other side. And so I will
Mhm.
shift my position to always be between her and what I see as either
The
the
greatest threat.
safety issue or the, yeah, out of respect, I always want to be the protector. And so
Right.
I'm still conscious of that with people that I'm with. And like you said, it's not always necessarily gender based.
That's true. Because interestingly enough, I actually witnessed this on a television show recently, on a Netflix show, about a girl wanting to show how she cared for someone, and she decided to walk on the outside. It made the man very uncomfortable, but they worked it out. It was
Okay.
a very funny scenario.
Interesting.
It was a little bit of comedy in that show, but it showed that rule still exists.
Still, it's still around for some people.
Yes, yes, it is. But some of the other things that are along these sort of gender lines about when you're making introductions, boys were supposed to stand in the past. Boys were supposed to stand whenever an introduction was made, but girls could remain sitting. And that is not the case today. As anybody who has any particular position or title, either gender is supposed to stand and show respect.
Yeah, and there are cultural I mean, there are places not just within our own country, culturally and geographically, but in different places in the world. And this is an entirely different topic that we could spend an entire episode on, about things that are considered appropriate, respectful, and disrespectful in other countries and in other cultures, right? But I
Mhm.
mean, that
Mhm.
definitely, that those types of things have certain universal characteristics.
Yeah, yeah. Carissa has a question there that says, "Do you think etiquette is considered less important to people today?" And I would say absolutely yes. I don't think people really care too much about the rules about how to treat people. If there's anything left, I think in common society, is that we are supposed to be kind and respect everyone. I think in this day and age where we're thinking about whose pronouns are who, you want to try to remain as neutral as
Mhm.
possible and respect a person's identity and how they identify themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that is the predominant, that sort of um, acceptance is what is sort of taking the replacement of what etiquette was in the 50s and 60s, or even in the Victorian times and things like that.
And I do think there are things like, what is taught to children. I don't think we're spending as much time talking about things like holding a chair. I still hold the car door open for my wife when she's
Wow,
getting
you're
in the car. Uh,
amazing.
and and she still appreciates it, that is something that's a habit of mine. But I do think that things have changed. You talked about there was a revolution, and it was interesting because even in my high school days, after my sister taught me that, I remember one time specifically, and my response maybe was not as appropriate as it might have been in my immaturity, although I think in a way there was some justice to it. But I was walking up to the school door, and a girl was coming toward me. I don't think I even knew her. Maybe had seen her passing in the halls, and I just automatically held the door. And she stopped and she gave me a really snide look, and she said, "I'm quite capable of holding my own door. I don't need to be patronized," or made some
That's right.
remark like that.
That's
And
right.
I said, "Oh,
So
okay." And I walked in and slammed the door behind me in her face. Basically, I was kind of like, "Fine, if you're going to be that way," but I wasn't patronizing you. I was being polite. I would have
be
held that
nice.
door for anybody. But
Yeah.
that was during that sort of the first part of the revolution in the 70s that was really
Yeah.
becoming prominent. And I did go to a school where there was that element was prominent in many ways. But I also think, I mean, we still teach our kids. I think most people still teach kids to say, please, thank you, you're welcome. Those
Mhm.
things are still part of common politeness and cordiality. I don't think we're as formal with many things. I mean, to your point about etiquette, I think we still taught our kids in setting the table, the fork goes on the left, the knife goes on the inside on the right with the blade facing in, and then the spoon goes next to that. You're usually not dealing with multiple forks, multiple spoons for various courses like you
Right.
would in informal society. But we still kind of, when we're having like a Thanksgiving dinner or that type of thing, we
Mhm.
still try
Mhm.
to set the table properly. you
Yeah.
know, and where the
Yeah.
glass goes and blah, blah, blah.
The thing is,
But we're not
the thing
as
is
caught up in
that,
that.
no, definitely not. And I have to tell from my own experience because, you know, I, I think etiquette stuck with me. You know, the place setting stuck with me because I love fancy. I love a beautiful table. And I have tried to teach my children how to do this, and they have at those holiday events have had to set the table
Yeah.
properly. And I use two forks, one for salad, one for, you
Yeah.
know, dinner. And I have dessert spoons and dessert forks above above the plate.
I love that.
And the thing is, my kids don't remember. I don't know. It's a pain in my side. It's a grief that they don't remember how to set the table. It didn't retain water. You know, it didn't
Yeah.
stay in their brain. So I don't know what to do about that because it's not important to them to remember how to set the table. My only hope is that when they sort of get to the point where they're setting their tables all the time, they'll like say, "Hey, mom, how did we do this?" And then they'll pick it up. That's my hope. But
That's interesting. You know,
they'll
I
pass
wonder
it
to
on.
some degree if also when we talk about modern times, and one of the other things that we have seen more prominent in modern times, and you see, I mean, we encounter it in our own interactions, I think, and we've seen so many shows and stuff about it, but where young people, it used to be one of the standards of etiquette, good manners, politeness was showing respect for elders, showing respect for
Mhm,
authority. And
mhm.
that seems to have, to a great degree, not universally, but in many situations, kind of gone by the wayside. And I wonder how much of that, AnnAlia, is tied to the fact that we don't spend as much time training our children. Do you think that there's a tie-in? Do you think that's because we're not teaching politeness and etiquette to the degree that we used to?
Well, I I think yes and no. I think yes, we don't teach it as much, but I think that my generation, I'm a child of the 70s, right? And 70s was also not just a gender revolution, but it was, you know, rejecting sort of government screwed up a lot. You know, people in authority really made some huge, horrendous mistakes that are not
And we
particularly
became aware of it,
acceptable.
I think, from the
Yeah,
standpoint of the media, really
that's
for the
right.
first time
And
on a
and
large
so
scale.
I think that my children really don't believe that adults or government officials or leaders are inherently worthy of that respect. So I think
Okay.
that they have to. I think nowadays we have to earn respect, and they give deference to people who have accomplished things. Like my children continue to talk about how impressed they are with certain YouTubers, and
Yeah.
um, you know these new industries that are emerging because of the internet. Um, so it's really I think that's really where it is. Don't see leaders as people who are inherently worthy of respect, and therefore we don't pay them the respect. And
Yeah.
to force our children to do so is almost hypocritical. And I think hypocrisy, along with awkwardness, are two of the major sins that this generation has a really hard time forgiving.
I love the fact that Shalane put this up here because made this comment because of her experience with you, and one of the reasons that she recommended you. And I like this idea, good manners. I think politeness in general, right? It's not for the person exhibiting it. It's to make others comfortable. The things that we do that reflect good manners are to, and you alluded to that, even in terms of things like people's pronouns and understanding where people are coming from and respect. I mean, if there's a lot of controversy around some of the modern movements, and we could get into the whole, there's so much controversy we're not going to get into, and I prefer not to see anything in the comments with people's opinions on woke and that type of thing. But there has been more of a consciousness in recent years toward respecting other people from a diversity perspective. We're more
Yeah.
conscious of that. And some
Yeah.
people may feel like maybe we've gone too far with that in some situations. Fine, you can have your opinion. But I do think that there is a relevance to the idea that maybe we have shifted in terms of how we understand respect for others. It may not have the same characteristics as it may have in times when you and I were growing up, but there is still I think there is still an understanding in society that we need to think about how we treat other people. I mean, the golden
Yes.
rule is still a part of the central basis for our behaviors, right?
Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, no, no, I don't think it actually is. I think there's a derivation on that people, you don't treat others as you want to be treated. You treat others as they want to be treated.
Yeah.
And I think that is the whole sort of pronoun thing goes right along with that. You need to be self-aware of yourself and understand where your boundaries are, but also you need to be aware of how other people present themselves and how other people want to be identified, and treat them with the respect of their culture, of their ideals, rather than imposing your views on them. So it's a little bit different that way.
Have we reached a point with that? This probably opens a can of worms, so I don't want to get too far down this because we're going to run out of time very shortly. But maybe I'll just make this comment: is I do wonder at times, and I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate here, but I do wonder at times if that change, the pendulum can swing far one way or another sometimes, and we kind of went to a point, as you talked about, during some of those revolution times where it became almost the norm to disrespect anyone we didn't agree with. And I wonder if now the pendulum has swung the other way, where we're so very sensitive to some of the issues of diversity and inclusion and that type of thing, where if we're not careful, that in and of itself can become patronizing. I think there needs to always be, to some degree, a genuineness to the way that we choose to treat people. If we're being too fakey about it, all we're doing is patronizing. And sometimes I think we need to check our own reasons and attitudes. Sometimes we're doing it out of just plain, it's the polite thing to do. I know I've done that in certain business settings, but particularly in our personal relationships, I think it's a huge mistake to try to be so, and maybe I'm approaching this wrong even in terms of what I'm saying, but I've seen situations where people are so concerned about trying to act a certain way that they lose the genuineness of relating to people. And I think there is a balance there to some degree.
Yeah. I think just like hypocrisy is one of the greatest sins of this generation, I think authenticity is one of the greatest virtues.
I love that. And I almost think we could just about end on that. But you had one more thing you wanted to share that was a quote, I think. Can I go ahead and
this ties into Shalann's comment about the formal dinners that we had at Christmas time in my home. When Shallann lived here, we used to have our small group get together, and we would learn how to do fancy because we loved fancy. But the important thing was that people feel comfortable. And I want to tell a story about, there's two things I want to say. Queen Victoria, who, let me get this back up here and move this over. Queen Victoria one time had a guest. This is a traditional story that she had a guest, and the rule is that you're always supposed to wait for the hostess before you eat at a formal table. And they also served finger bowls where you were actually supposed to wash your hands.
Yes.
And then dry them on a towel. But the guest didn't know that, and he actually drank his finger bowl. And so Queen Victoria picked up her finger bowl and drank it as well, because the primary rule of etiquette is to make your guests feel comfortable. Yeah. And so this quote here by Emily Post is something to live by. Manners are a sensitive awareness of the feelings of others. If you have that awareness, you have good manners, no matter which fork you use. Oh. And that is Emily Post, who is she's my etiquette Bible person. So
I love that.
That's that.
Well, listen, time is now running out. So I just want to say once again, AnnAlia Young, thank you so much for taking the time to come on here. Thank you so much for your research and for living a life since your school days where manners, etiquette, politeness, proper behavior has still been something that you yourself have wanted to make a part of your life, and that you have been willing and have shared that with others, your own kids, even if they can't remember the table settings for the formal. But you can see with people like Shalane that there are lessons that have stuck. And I will say from my own experience, those lessons from long ago remain important. So thank you for that. And thank you for just being here. Thanks for being a friend.
Yeah, I'm glad to see you, Steve. And thank you to all the guests who came. It was my pleasure to be here.
All right. Hey, I'm going to put you in the green boom, but if you wouldn't mind hanging around for a minute, I got a couple of follow-ups when we get off the air for you. So once again, AnnAlia, thank you very much.
All right.
I'll tell you something. First of all, I appreciate good friends. I appreciate people who are willing to take the time to share the things in their own lives that are important. But I also want to, before we go, because we are pretty much out of time, I want to share the things that are coming up in the next few weeks so that you'll know what to tune into. And next week, we're going to talk about identity. I just think it's an interesting thing when we talk about how do we identify ourselves, and kind of along the lines of what we were talking about here with pronouns and different things that we identify ourselves. But where does our identity come from? There's so many situations where people get their who they are from the do. In other words, careers and other factors can so often cause us to identify ourselves because of the things that we do. But is our identity genetic? Do we inherit certain things? Is it come from things that we're exposed to, et cetera? So we're going to talk about that a little bit next week. A couple of weeks. This one's very interesting. We're going to have a lady on by the name of Celeste Moy. She's an attorney who works in the entertainment industry, and she actually helps run a foundation that is based on her sister's life, Sylvia Moy, who passed away in 2017. Now, Sylvia Moy, you may or may not be familiar with her name, but Sylvia Moy is in the Songwriters Hall of Fame. She was very involved in Motown, actually wrote or co-wrote many big hits, including many of Stevie Wonder's biggest hits. Sylvia Moy was involved in writing. When she passed away, her siblings got together to start a foundation that would raise money to support up-and-coming artists and to also keep some of those songs alive. And they have an event each year that takes place in Detroit, the home of Motown, that is a cover song contest. And Celeste Moy is going to be on in a couple of weeks to talk about her sister and to talk about that contest and talk about the foundation. I think that's going to be fascinating. And then we're going to have a return guest in 3 weeks. Most of you are familiar with Ann Davis East, who comes on from time to time to share what's on her bookshelf, talk about books and authors, and give us some insight about books that we may be wanting to read and add to our own bookshelf. She'll have a topic and a theme for that she'll want to talk about. So I also just want to quickly remind you that in addition to Coffee Breaks with Steve being on Facebook and YouTube, or you may be watching it now, the episodes are also available to go back and watch on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, actually available as video and audio on Spotify and audio on the other two platforms. But you can find and refer people to Coffee Breaks with Steve in those locations. All right, we are basically completely out of time. And so I do want to once again say thank you to our guest today, AnnAlia Young. I want to thank you to all of you for being here today and being a part of this and a part of what we do every week. I don't take for granted that you take the time to tune in each week, many of you every single week, to be a part of the conversation. And it's interesting because we think about manners, we think about how we treat other people, and it's a reminder that we all have the opportunity to do something that treats someone else with the degree of respect and the degree of cordiality that everybody is due. And so that's just a good starting point to think about what I remind you of every single week. And I say it out loud because it's a good reminder to myself, but let's find a way to make a difference in our worlds this week. God bless you. Thank you for being here. I'll see you again soon.